In ancient Rome, a senator named Agrippinus had his villa confiscated by Emperor Nero without warning or explanation. When messengers arrived to deliver the news, they found Agrippinus calmly continuing with his daily exercises. "What will you do now that you've lost your home?" they asked in astonishment. Agrippinus simply replied, "I plan to finish my workout." Imagine you were Agrippinus. How would you react to losing your home by imperial decree? Would you rage against the injustice? Fall into despair? Plead for mercy? For most of us, these would all be natural reactions. But not for Agrippinus, a devoted student of Stoicism. One small decision creates a ripple effect through time, and one small shift in perspective can transform how we experience life's inevitable challenges. The essence of letting go is at the heart of Stoic wisdom. After studying under Musonius Rufus, Agrippinus had internalized the most powerful lesson of Stoicism: attachment is the source of suffering. According to the Stoics, while we can't control the events that happen to us, we have complete authority over how we respond to them. Rather than clinging desperately to things we're destined to lose anyway, Stoics focus on maintaining their inner tranquility, regardless of external circumstances. Today, people often think of letting go as giving up or surrendering, as if it's an admission of defeat. But the original concept behind Stoic detachment was much more than that. Rather than just a passive acceptance, letting go was an active practice of freedom. It was a way of life, and that way of living with less attachment has survived for over 2,000 years. Stoic detachment can be applied to our modern lives just as effectively as it was in ancient times. This philosophy allows us to process the pain of loss without being consumed by it, transforming our suffering into wisdom that gives us perspective. Perspective is everything, and each person's ability to let go is shaped by their unique experiences and outlook. Since the Stoics taught in public spaces, accessible to all, their methods for letting go were widely available. They believed these techniques should benefit everyone, not just the privileged few. As a result, slaves and emperors alike practiced the art of detachment. And they did. Epictetus, who began life as a slave with a permanently damaged leg, wrote that freedom is not achieved by satisfying desire, but by eliminating it. Seneca, who lost his wealth and position multiple times during his life, taught that wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. Marcus Aurelius, despite being emperor of Rome, reminded himself daily that you have power over your mind, not outside events. So why do so many people struggle with letting go? In a world where we're constantly encouraged to acquire more, our attachments often dictate our emotional state. In reality, we don't suffer because we lose things. We suffer because we never expected to lose them in the first place. Death is natural. It helps clear space for new life, returns nutrients to the earth, and maintains the balance of ecosystems. But the truth is, when that dark reality touches someone we love, it's never easy to accept. So why don't we live in constant fear of death? It's because although the situation is painful, we've learned to expect it. It's something that is unavoidable. We can't control mortality. Although it hurts, life continues and healing eventually follows. Stoicism teaches us that in the same way, we should expect that everything we cherish will eventually be lost. Picture saying goodbye to everything you love, and be content knowing it will happen. One of the Stoic practices is known as negative visualization, an exercise aimed at reducing attachment anxiety. Imagine your partner leaving you, your home burning down, your career ending abruptly. Things like this. This practice helps you understand that even your worst fears, if realized, won't destroy you completely if your mindset is prepared. With our current culture where social media constantly shows us what others have that we don't, we're made to believe that happiness comes from accumulation rather than liberation. This message about letting go is more relevant now than ever. We enter relationships not knowing how they'll end. We acquire possessions not knowing how long they'll last. And sometimes, all these sources of temporary happiness become sources of lasting pain. The question is, do we need to hold on to everything so tightly? If we do, we could unknowingly be creating the conditions for our own suffering, leaving us ultimately disappointed and heartbroken in the end. That's no way to live. We should instead focus on enjoying what we have while we have it, without demanding that it last forever. We should appreciate things for what they are, not for what we need them to be. Attaching expectations of permanence to the temporary things in our lives almost always leads to disappointment. Most of the time, we end up trying to fill that inevitable emptiness with more external things. Rushing into a new relationship after a breakup, replacing the car that got stolen, or renovating the house to distract from family problems. Sometimes we do all these things to avoid facing the reality of impermanence. But Stoicism teaches that if you approach life this way, you place your peace in the hands of external forces. Forces that will always eventually fail. Relationships change, possessions break down, and even our own bodies will one day return to dust. But even the most painful losses come with a hidden gift. The gift of space, both physical and mental. As Seneca once wrote, "It is not the man who is too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor." Learning to live with empty hands will create space in your life for something new to enter. Instead, we must place our peace on our capacity to adapt to changing circumstances and not on the circumstances themselves. We must choose to let go gracefully, regardless of what life takes from us. Because regardless of what it is we want to keep, at the end of the day, we don't have any control over how long we get to keep it. But we do have all the control over how we respond when it's time to let it go. That is the dichotomy of control, the cornerstone of Stoic practice. Stoics teach that we must learn to separate what we control from what we cannot control. We need to determine our value not from things we will inevitably lose, but from the dignity and grace with which we lose them. Attachment to outcomes is natural, but breaking down when things change is, in a Stoic's view, unnecessary suffering. Raising children is perhaps the ultimate exercise in letting go. First, you must nurture and protect them completely. Then teach them independence, which takes forever. Then guide them through adolescence, suffer through their mistakes, celebrate their victories, help them find their path, and finally, release them entirely into the world. Everything up until the point where they leave home is preparation for letting go. However, once they're gone, many parents still cling to control. Still, a lot of people judge their success as parents based on how closely their children's lives match their expectations, a metric which, for the most part, is beyond their control. Stoics teach that instead, you should judge your success by the quality of presence and wisdom you offered while they were in your care, not on the outcome of your hopes for their future. Trust the process. Think about someone who has been in a loving relationship for years. They now feel entitled to their partner's continued affection, and so they become complacent, taking the relationship for granted. Their partner eventually leaves, and they're devastated, thinking they must be unlovable. They don't consider that people change, circumstances evolve, or that perhaps the relationship had simply run its course. They don't see the bigger picture, but they're still heartbroken. If they had simply cherished each day of the relationship without expectation, practiced gratitude instead of entitlement, they could have experienced both the relationship and its ending with more peace. With the right perspective, the end wouldn't be seen as failure, but as completion. It's this reframing of your mindset that is crucial. A true Stoic does not measure their happiness by what they manage to keep, but is comforted by the fact that they can live a meaningful life regardless of what has been taken away. These are the four virtues that guide the Stoic practice of letting go. Wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Wisdom is understanding the temporary nature of all things and choosing our response to inevitable loss. As Epictetus said, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Courage. 2 words. Accept and release. Temperance, or moderation, applies to our attachments as well as our possessions. Don't hold too tightly to what was never truly yours. While billionaires build underground bunkers to preserve their lives and fortunes, Stoics believe that a good life consists not of extending its length or accumulating more, but in being ready to let it all go at any moment. Justice is perhaps the most difficult virtue to practice when letting go. It reminds us that we are not entitled to keep anything, not health, wealth, or loved ones, because we were all born to share in both the pleasures and pains of existence, and to bear them with dignity. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, much of it in a tiny cell on Robben Island. During this time, he was permitted 1 visitor a year for 30 minutes. He could write and receive 1 letter every 6 months. By any measure, his life had been taken from him. When he was finally released and later became president of South Africa, many expected him to seek vengeance against those who had imprisoned him and enforced apartheid. But of course he did not. Throughout his imprisonment, Mandela had studied Stoic philosophy and embodied its principles of letting go, not just of his freedom, but of his anger and resentment as well. Instead of clinging to the past injustices, Nelson Mandela urged reconciliation and healing. He understood that holding on to anger, even justified anger, would only prolong suffering. As he said, resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. This is the way of the Stoic. In modern psychology, Stoic detachment forms the foundation of acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT helps patients to let go of the internal struggle with painful thoughts and feelings, accepting them as part of being human while committing to actions that create a meaningful life. It allows you to observe your attachments without being controlled by them, and when you realize that many of them are unnecessary sources of suffering, you can then choose a more liberated and purposeful path. This approach recognizes the Stoic principle that humans find peace not through control, but through surrender, even in the darkest of circumstances. We can live with greater serenity simply by loosening our grip on what we cannot keep anyway. As many of us know though, this is easier said than done. It's a practice, much like everything else. We have to rewire the way we think, out with clinging, in with letting go. To find peace amidst loss, we must practice detachment daily. By redirecting our sense of security away from the impermanent, we can stop dreading inevitable change, and overall, we can lead a much more peaceful and accepting life. Stoicism helps us navigate the currents of attachment and loss toward the shore of inner tranquility. And if our voyage ends before we reach that shore, we can take comfort in having traveled well, even if not as far as we had hoped. Because remember, everything that begins must also end.